morning. I hope you are doing well. I'm currently out in the north of Ubud in Bali, taking some photos on this beautiful morning. And today we're going to be covering a subject that I've been wanting to cover for a while, and that is how to take sharp images every time. Like, I'm talking crispy, absolute tack sharp images every shot. Let's get into it. So to make sure you're taking the sharpest images possible when shooting, you want to be focusing on three main things. And those three things are your shutter speed, your aperture, and your focus mode. These things all work in unison and work together. So let's jump into them one by one and explain exactly how they work and exactly how you can use them to be making sure you're taking the sharpest images possible. All right, so the first one we're going to be covering is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed dictates how long the shutter of the camera is open and exposed to light for. So a faster shutter speed, like let's go 1/1250, is going to sound like this. Be really quick, and it's just open close straight away. A shutter speed like this is going to freeze the motion and usually result in sharper images. The biggest takeaway from the shutter speed is actually what focal length you're shooting on. So a very general rule of thumb is to always make sure you're shooting at least whatever your focal length is, 1/whatever. Does that make sense? I'll explain. So for example, on this 16 to 35mm lens, if I was to be shooting at about 24mm, I'd want to be shooting at a minimum, an absolute minimum of 1/25. Now, I can probably still get fairly blurry images with this, so an even better rule of thumb is to double that. So I'd be shooting at 1/50. So this can ensure that there'll be very minimal, like I'm talking very minimal shake in your images in regards to the shutter speed, because as you get wider, it's easier to hold the camera still and the little shakes won't get picked up as much. But as you get tighter, like for example on 35mm, or if I'm shooting with my 70 to 200 lens, I'm going to be wanting to use a much faster shutter speed. So if I was shooting at 200mm on my 70 to 200mm lens, I'd want to be shooting at a minimum of at least 1/200, and in ideal conditions, a minimum of at least 1/400. It's a fairly general rule of thumb, but keep that in mind when you're shooting. Now, that's only one half of the shutter speed. The other half is what you're actually taking photos of. Is your subject moving fast? Is it a landscape? Is it an F1 car zooming down a track? I don't know, and this is where you're going to have to get a little bit experimental with it. If you're shooting a landscape that's nice and still and static and absolutely nothing is moving, then you can afford to use a slower shutter speed. On the other hand, if you're shooting sports, if you're shooting moving subjects, people, busy city, whatever the case, you're going to want to be using a much faster shutter speed. And that's just so you can freeze the motion in time and make sure you're capturing all that sharp goodness. Alright, so the next setting is going to be aperture. Now, aperture is a strange one because if you buy a nice prime lens with a really quick aperture, you might be tempted to always use the lowest aperture possible. Now, it's fun, it's great, and don't get me wrong, I can totally understand why you'd want to do that, but you might not always get the sharpest result. Let me explain. If we take this 50mm lens here, for example, it has an f-stop of 1.4. Now, obviously that's not its only f-stop. I can go all the way up to f22. Now, either one of those is not going to be the lens's sharpest. Somewhere in the middle is going to be the absolute sharpest. But of course, you might want to get that really dreamy, blurry background that only 1.4 can give. Now, by all means, shoot at 1.4. God, it looks good. But if you want the absolute sharpest results, try stepping down just a few stops from its maximum aperture. So, for example, if this lens shoots at 1.4, which it does, I might be best off shooting at 2.5, 2.8, or even f4. I'm going to get some really sharp results in comparison to shooting at f1.4. Your subject also influences your choice of aperture like crazy. If you're shooting vast landscapes which are hundreds of meters, if not kilometers away, there is no reason at all for you to be shooting at f2.8. Like, you're not trying to get any depth in there. Any kind of landscape shots, you really should be shooting at a high aperture. Now, what's that high aperture? Well, every lens is different, but in saying that, In my opinion, I really like shooting between f6.3 and f8. That is the sweet spot for landscape photography with the gear that I have. It might be different for you, but that is kind of where it sits for me. And then in saying that, if you wanted to take portraits, well, you want to blow out that background and really isolate that subject, which maybe 1.4 is perfect for. But if you're only shooting at 1.4, you might get the tip of the nose in focus and the eyes are completely out of focus. It's always nice to step down a few stops from the lens's maximum aperture to make sure you're getting the sharpest images possible. All right, let's move on to focus mode because this one is interesting. And home sweet home. Oh, all right, after that nice hour drive, we are now home. All right, so the third and final tip on how to take sharp images every shot is to change your focus mode. Now, there are two focus modes I use 99% of the time, and that is AF one shot, which is autofocus one shot, or AF continuous. So let's cover AF servo first. This is the focus mode that is going to change and continuously ping back and forth while you're half pressing that shutter button down. So this is perfect, and it is the only focus mode you should be using with moving subjects. This is so as your subject is moving in and out of focus, the camera can keep up and continuously keep it in focus. And you can probably guess what AF one shot is. It is simply when you have your subject, your scene, and you half press the shutter button, it locks that focus. So the subject can move back and forward, you can move back and forward, and it's not going to change. It's just going to have that focus point locked in, and you can come in and out of focus. This is perfect for landscapes because one, it's not using as much battery. Two, it's going to be a little bit more accurate, and it's not consistently hunting and pinging back and forth with the focusing. So yeah, as long as you have your shutter speed nice and accurate for the subject you're shooting and the lens you're shooting with, your aperture set to a reasonable aperture depending on what subject you're shooting and of course what lens you're shooting with, and you have your autofocus set up for the subject that you're shooting, you can take ultra sharp images on every camera you pick up. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, let me know down in the comments below. It has been a beautiful morning and the day has gotten perfect. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my day now, and I'll catch you guys next week. Peace!